Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for this video. This was my biggest project to date, at least for video purposes. People have been asking me for ages to create a snowy scene or create an autumn scene, so I thought, well, why not do them both in one video? Considering this was my first time modelling snow, I was pleased with how this turned out. There are a few things I would do differently next time, which I'll explain during the course of the video, but overall, yeah, I was very happy with how this entire piece turned out. I hope you don't mind, but this is a very long introductory section, longer than I've ever done before, but you know, it's a long piece. It took up a lot of table room. And just to anyone saying I should have brushed the surface of the river before taking photos, I did actually. Those spots are just where the light has caught the ripples. I've noticed a few stray strands of static grass on the rocks as I've been watching this back, but you know what? I'm not going to worry about that. I'm grateful to the following companies for gifting me their products as featured in this video: Nock, Diorama Precipe, Hotwire Foam Factory and Plasticoat. Thanks for supporting me. So on with the build. As usual, I started with extruded polystyrene. These blocks are 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters and they're 7 centimeters thick. And to begin with, I marked on all four pieces where the river would enter and exit. And then I used the Hotwire Foam Factory's hand routing tool, fixed to a homemade sled because I don't actually own their official sled, to carve out the basic river channel. Make sure you're in a well ventilated space for this. You don't really want to be breathing in these fumes. Going slowly is key here, otherwise you pull on the wire, creating an uneven depth. No doubt you can achieve neater cuts than I got here, but I wasn't bothered really because all of this would be covered in Sculptamold anyway, and the tool made my life a hell of a lot easier. Imagine having to cut this out using a knife or something. No thank you very much. Anyway, here's where I marked the ends of each piece so that I would know which piece fitted against which piece. And then I mixed up the Sculptamold into a fairly thick paste. Then I spread this over the riverbed, being careful to keep things even as I passed the gaps. In other words, to make sure that the pieces still fitted together perfectly. I then set about building the banks, and for this I just used more extruded polystyrene, cut into rough blocks, and placed either side of the gaps. I then stuck these down with a bit of PVA glue and then carved these into shape using my trusty hand router from the Hotwire Foam Factory again. You can see it's a very versatile piece of kit. And then I covered these in Sculptamold as well. You can see here I'm being careful to maintain that perfect fit between the pieces. And after about 5 or 6 hours, the Sculptamold has completely cured and it's time to start edging the foam, and for this I'm going to be using 3mm MDF. It's just glued on with PVA and held down with a variety of pots and jars. Because the front of the diorama was lower than the rear of the diorama on account of having no raised banks, I cut these down to size using a hobby saw, and I tried to saw them into a more organic shape. There we go, very neat, and of course all the ends match. Oh, and I needed to blend these in with some more Sculptamold. And I took the opportunity to add some more interest to the banks in the form of lumps and bumps. Now, it's a long time since I've used these Woodland Scenics rock moulds, though you wouldn't guess it by the state of them. And I used some sculpting plaster from WWS. This is a lightweight plaster that's easy to carve. And since I wasn't after the entire rock mould section, I didn't mind that they broke here. In fact, that can really help you to build up some interesting rock faces. Now, I could have used more Sculptamold here, but I thought I'd try this fibre mould from WWS, and I can report that it dries a lot faster, but that's actually a good thing in certain circumstances, and here it did a very good job of blending the rocks together. You can see I've just employed trial and error to position these rocks. And it's important to get a good idea of where you're going to be placing them before you use this fibre mould, because otherwise the fibre mould will dry, as I said, fairly quickly, and you'll be left with a rock surface that you're not entirely happy with. But for me, for this use, I prefer the fibre mould because it's easily carvable afterwards, more so than Sculptamold. However, I would continue to use the Sculptamold for larger surfaces and for building up landforms. And that's because it has a longer working life. I keep all these smaller pieces of plaster to use as talus, and I just squeezed these in between the rocks, pressing them into the fibre mould just before it dried, and especially along the bottom near the water's edge. I'd forgotten how much fun it is to use rock moulds and what amazing results you can get from using them, so I'll certainly be using them again soon. Now, to create further rough or stony ground, I'm going to be using some textured plaster, again from WWS. I bought these as part of a big pack. And I also used this to blend in any gaps between or around the rocks. I just used filler, or spackle as it's known in the US, to coat the exposed ends of each piece. And then once everything had dried, I gave it a good spray with Hydro Primer from Plasticoat. This is light grey. Just make sure you do this in a well ventilated space, or outside ideally, and use an appropriate mask. And then I decided to make my own mud paste, because mud pastes can be very expensive if you buy them from the shop. So for this I used some brown paint. You could use any brown paint as long as it's water based, and into this I mixed various scenic materials, including some earth texture from Diorama Presepe, and some sand and some bark pieces, and also some matte medium to give it a matte finish and to act as a bit of a binder. And I started on the spring section and then moved on to summer, and for the summer section I lightened the mixture with a little bit of sand coloured acrylic paint, because, you know, the earth would have been baked that bit more and be a bit lighter, and I wanted you to be able to differentiate between the pieces between the seasons. I went lighter again through autumn, more with an idea of it matching the autumn foliage. And for winter I used some Payne's Grey, which is a kind of bluey blacky grey, and mixed this into the brown because, you know, it's winter, it's darker in winter. Right, so with my lovely mud down, it was time to start painting the rocks, and I didn't wait for the mud to dry before I started doing this because I didn't mind that the ink I was going to be using would mix into the mud and create a nice kind of swirly pattern. In fact, it would lend a really nice kind of shade to the mud, and as a bonus it allowed me to use some of the muddy ink to create extra shades for the rocks. Now the black ink I'm using here is homemade from acrylic ink, distilled water and matte medium. Luke from Geek Gaming has a very good tutorial on how to make this kind of ink. And I also used some green wash from Vallejo. This is their Game Wash range. And finally I used a small amount of Gryph-Charger Grey contrast paint from Citadel. Now this is brilliant for rock surfaces, but it is also rather expensive, so I go fairly lightly with this. Diorama Precipe gave me some amazing static grass to use in my videos, as did Nock, and there's some woodland scenic stuff at the end as well. And I'm a very lucky boy because Nock also gifted me their amazing Grassmaster 3 Profi to try out in a video a while ago, and since I'd run out of Mod Podge matte or any other basing glue, I thought I'd try this matte decoupage glue from Decomache. For spring I used some 4mm spring static grass from Diorama Precipe. Then I applied some WWS layering spray over that, and followed that up with a lighter coating of 6mm light green woodland scenic static grass. For summer I laid some 12mm Nock Meadow Wildgrass static grass over the top of some 6mm Woodland Scenics light green static grass. For autumn I used various beigey, browny, greeny shades from Diorama Precipe. They have an amazing range. And I topped that off with a light coating of Nock's beige 6mm static grass. And then for winter I kept it fairly dark with some brown and green shades from Diorama Precipe and kept it at 4mm. And that was when I realised I hadn't left spaces in the grass for the trees, so I made some little holes in it with my finger while the grass wasn't quite set in place. All the trees on this diorama were made using Nature Trees from Nock. This is Seafoam. And I selected the most tree-ish pieces. I also used some fall mix fine leaf foliage from Woodland Scenics, some early and late fall foliage from Woodland Scenics as well, and various shades of bush foliage. That's B-U-S-C-H bush. Then I shaped each piece of Seafoam, put on a mask, and gave them a spray with some matte black spray paint. Just a light coating to leave some of the woody colour showing through. And then coated the branches with some Hobby & Craft glue from Plasticoat in a well ventilated space with a mask. And pressed small pieces of the foam foliage into the branches. It holds fairly well, but you'll need to apply several more coats of glue and keep building up the foam. This is Bush's light green variety, which I used for spring, of course. Looks pretty good, eh? I'll whiz through the next lot. This is bush mid-green for the summer trees, or is it called medium green? I can't remember. Anyway, for the rusty autumn trees I mixed some woodland scenics and bush varieties of foliage. And the other autumn trees were made using woodland scenics early fall. When it came to the winter trees, I used scenic snowflakes from Deluxe Materials. I gave the trees a spray with glue over a dirty surface and then over a nice clean surface that I could use to collect the excess snow. I sprinkled over these beautiful realistic flakes. I only actually had to apply one layer of glue to make an awesome looking snowy tree. Now placing these trees in the diorama couldn't be easier. You just use a pointed tool to make a hole, squish in some glue and stick in your tree. For the summer section I decided to add some ground foam from Woodland Scenics. This is their mid-green coarse turf, or is it medium green? I've forgotten. Anyway, I soaked it with isopropyl alcohol to break the surface tension, which allows the scenic glue to soak through and lock it in place. This little tree here is actually a piece of fine leaf foliage from Woodland Scenics. And before I placed the winter trees I needed to apply the snow, and for this I used some snow paste gifted to me by Nock, and I just spread this over the grass, allowing some of the grass to poke through the surface of the snow. This can go on fairly thick and it levels itself out, so be careful of it sliding down the surface of your rocks. But I also applied some onto the ledges of the rocks. And while that paste was still wet, it will remain wet for a little while because it takes quite a long time to dry, I sprinkled over some of the Deluxe Materials snowflakes again, deliberately getting some over the rest of the rocks. And then once the paste had dried, I gave everything a thorough coating with isopropyl alcohol and some more scenic glue. And then I could place the trees much as before. So that was winter done for now. It was time to move on to the foliage for spring and summer. And for that I used, what else? Materials by Diorama Precipe, which I think are truly astounding. A lot of it is stabilised natural material, so it's fairly fragile, like these flowers. But what you get is some unbelievably realistic scenery. Look at these small tufts of grass here, and these absolutely stunning white flowers. I tell you what, making a spring scene with Diorama Precipe is, well, it's a lot easier than not using Diorama Precipe. And I'd just like to say thank you so much to Fabio, the owner of Diorama Precipe, for supporting me so much and being so generous in gifting me these materials that have really helped me elevate my craft. For summer, I decided to go with some flowering bushes. This is seafoam material and it forms a major part of Diorama Pressipé's range. Incidentally, that glue you can see is from the ground foam I applied earlier on. And here I'm just stitching these little flowering tufts into the ground, and now I'm applying some flowers that look like foxgloves, or digitalis to give it its proper name, I think. Either way, it's all pretty stunning stuff, I'm sure you'll agree. And now for autumn, I just used some loose pieces of foliage to simulate a carpet of fallen leaves. And these got the isopropyl alcohol and scenic glue treatment. And when the glue had dried, I went in with some dry bushes and some more autumnal flowers from Diorama Pressipé. So, on to water effects, once I'd mopped up that glue of course. For the dam I just used some masking tape. I actually sealed the edge with some glue, but I didn't film that, sorry. And as usual, I used a 2-part epoxy resin mixed in equal parts. Just make sure you follow the manufacturer's safety instructions, and this will be about the easiest water effects you'll ever do. Stir the 2 parts together slowly to avoid introducing too many bubbles, but it's not really an issue to remove the bubbles later. Now to tint the resin, as I said, I'm using glass paints. I'm using Vitria and I'm using roughly 2:1 earth brown to oriental green. Just remember, you really don't have to use very much at all. It's best to add small amounts and build it up slowly. And again, give it a thorough, slow stir. When pouring the resin, remember to measure the height against the masking tape so that you get an equal distribution of resin across the entire piece. In other words, so that the water is at the same height from one piece to the next. I ended up mixing some more resin because I ran out halfway through, but you could probably tell that already. And because the resin is fairly thick, it tends to leave a lip, so here I'm just teasing out the edge. And to remove any bubbles, I'm just giving it a fine misting with isopropyl alcohol. This particular resin takes 24 hours to cure. Here I'm removing the masking tape dam at about 20 hours, so the resin isn't quite solid, but it's certainly stiff enough to remove the dam. And it makes removing the meniscus, where the resin rises up the dam, easier with a sharp blade, although I have to be honest, I didn't do a very good job here. I plan to go back and fix it, but I ran out of time for this video. I'll explain how at the end, but for now I'll show you how I made the ripples, and I did this in the usual style. I used Mod Podge gloss and then blew it about with a straw. But for this diorama I decided not to cover the entire surface of the resin with the Mod Podge, but to leave some of the shiny surface showing through, and then to draw some ripples and eddies into the Mod Podge using the end of my brush. For the winter section, of course, the water would be frozen. But I didn't want this stream to all of a sudden just stop flowing, So I blended the end in with some Mod Podge gloss and gave it a few ripples. Then I painted on some more of the snow paste along the edges of the river and sprinkled over some of the deluxe material snowflakes to simulate the frozen edge of the water. And then waited for all of that and the Mod Podge to completely dry, and wow, I was happy with how that turned out, especially with those beautiful little eddies drawn into the surface. I mean, I just think this is the best river surface I've created so far. Anyway, after all that had dried, I took some clear sealer from Plasticoat and dull coated the surface of the winter river. And after that, all that was left was to paint the sides a matte black. For this I used gesso, which tends to cover absolutely everything. And there we have it, my finished Four Seasons river, or river in four seasons if you will. Now if I was going to fix those water transitions where I overcut the meniscus, I would apply a dam at the height to which I wanted to pour the resin, and then pour another layer of resin right up to the top of that dam to avoid the issue of the meniscus completely. But I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I'm very happy with how this turned out overall. There are always a few things that you'd do better given the chance to make the piece again. Thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe, and a huge thanks to my Patreon supporters who help me keep going with this, and I hope you enjoy the written tutorials I post over on my Patreon page each month. Thanks again, take care, bye!